Skeleton Crew is delightful, and I'm going to tell you why. Advanced warning, there will be spoilers, so click away now if you haven't seen the show yet. You've been warned. Greetings, Spacefarers, I'm Michael. First off, I'm not even that big of a Star Wars guy. I've always been more into Star Trek myself, but even I can see what is so appealing about this show. The unabashedly awkward child acting, the simplistic yet straightforward dialogue, heck, even the visual style seems to be catered to make you smile and switch off your brain for 45 minutes. There's no misguided attempt to have the audience contemplating complex thematics or questioning moral extremes. It's just plain old-fashioned good guys versus bad guys with very little ambiguity. And that's pretty much Star Wars in a nutshell to me. This was always the formula that worked, and honestly why I think so many struggled to accept the prequel trilogy, and the vast majority of what Disney has made since The Force Awakens. Star Wars ultimately was never meant to be that deep. When the original trilogy was released, there was no pre-established notions of what any of it meant. It was simply a unique idea from a bold filmmaker to take audiences on an adventure to a world where magic and science coexisted in an effort to entertain and sell toys. And damn, did it do that well. I couldn't even begin to imagine what the popular culture landscape would be like without lightsabers and Death Stars, video games, and endless lines of fanfiction. George Lucas himself probably couldn't have imagined it at the time either. Nevertheless, those movies resonated with so many people, and the popularity of it isn't going anywhere, and it perhaps never will. Even today, the franchise appears to have more lives than a house cat. Either that, or the fanbase has a shorter memory than one. I'll let you decide. So when Skeleton Crew premiered on Disney+, like with all Star Wars shows, many probably believed it had about a 50-50 chance of being received as yet another blemish on people's so-called childhoods, or the show that would save Star Wars. So it was quite the delight to yours truly that it ended up being neither, and clearly wasn't even trying to be. It came as no shock at all to me that the best recipe to crafting a story based on family-friendly children's movies would be to tell a story aimed at, well, children. And perhaps one of the biggest strokes of genius from Skeleton Crew was to utilize a premise that I'm sure many of us fantasized about ourselves when we were younger, finding a crashed spaceship with our friends and blasting off on an adventure, not knowing what was in store for us. Though it's marketed specifically for children, there's something in Skeleton Crew for all ages, which, in retrospect, is kind of the missing ingredient in most recent film and television shows that have the Star Wars brand slapped on it. For instance, The Last Jedi isn't simply just a bad movie, it's more likely a bad movie with the makings of a good movie buried beneath the surface. And you could also make that assessment of the prequel trilogy. The Phantom Menace was, at its core, an attempt to bring subterfuge and intrigue to the franchise, but in its haste to explain what didn't really need explaining, both of these examples kind of forgot that there was supposed to be something in there for kids to enjoy. And no, Jar Jar and young Anakin were not the answer. Because of this, most of Star Wars post-Return of the Jedi tends to end up feeling like it was aimed at no one at all. Quite frankly, I believe Star Wars is at its best when it just decides to be nothing more than Star Wars, a tale of princesses, swashbucklers, and wizards in space. And though Skeleton Crew could be considered a little light on the wars element, it actually makes up for the lack of true stakes by thrusting children into the narrative. It could be argued that the premise isn't at all that dangerous for our characters. There's no evil empire blowing up planets, no heroic rebellion fighting through insurmountable odds to save the galaxy. Yes, indeed, if this crashed spaceship had been discovered by Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, and Han Solo, it would be, for lack of a better term, child's play to them. But when you insert Fern, KB, Neil, and Wim into this scenario, getting lost in space and hunted down by pirates suddenly becomes instantly more dangerous. There's something super relatable about watching these kids slowly discover that their sheltered lives aren't as safe as they initially believed, and it works for all demographics. I've seen some people compare this show to The Goonies, and whether or not you're a fan of that film, it stands the test of time for many because of its coming-of-age relatability. Each of the kids in Skeleton Crew represents a playground stereotype, and they all wonderfully portray what it's like to realize your ego isn't as strong as you thought it was. Something I'm sure everyone must go through at some point, especially when you're young. And it's through these realizations, as each of the kids comes to terms with their situation, that they are able to reconcile with one another and persevere to find their way home. Another facet of Skeleton Crew that works heavily in its favour is how it handles mystery and its self-awareness as a show about Star Wars. I honestly was shocked at how much restraint the creators showed when it came to how quickly they had a character ignite a lightsaber. It's 5 episodes, by the way, and even then it happens at the very end. The inclusion of the Force and the Jedi in general as this mythical presence is handled 1,000 times greater than it ever was in the sequel trilogy. The Force-sensitive character, Zod, excellently played by Jude Law, is an unnerving and surprisingly unique take on such a character that I legitimately was shocked to learn he is in fact a giant piece of shit. There's still a chance he might turn out to be a hero, but I kind of don't want him to. It's more interesting this way. And as a villain, he is far more threatening than any amount of extended deep lore cuts could ever hope to achieve. And you see, that's just the thing. I hear many Star Wars fans talk openly about how they wish to see the Star Wars universe expanded upon. But I just find the more you try to make the galaxy far, far away make sense, the more ridiculous it becomes. This may be a hot take, but I think it serves us better as nothing more than a stage to tell stories, as opposed to an ever-changing encyclopedia that requires a scholar for every entry. Harkening back to this idea that Star Wars is at its best when it sticks to the formula that made it what it is, the genre it most closely fits between sci-fi and fantasy is clearly fantasy. And as such, it allows for a story like Skeleton Crew to fit into the larger world with very little explanation needed, because the perspective we are given is one that portrays the world as unknown, mythical, legendary. Something for the young cast of characters to have hope in and believe in the better wide universe of the Republic and the Jedi, making the unfortunate revelation about who Zod actually is hit not only the audience in the gut, but also Wim, Fern, KB, and Neil. In essence, Skeleton Crew is delightful not because it's a cerebral Nolan-esque Shakespearean masterpiece, but because it's pure, relatable, and evocative. It doesn't tell its audience how or what to feel, it just tries to make you feel. Which, if you travelled back to 1977 and asked George Lucas himself, is probably more than he ever hoped to achieve with his silly little space opera script. Well, that and to make millions of dollars. So whether you felt you've enjoyed Skeleton Crew or not so far, I find it infinitely commendable for not trying to make Star Wars more than it ought to be, but simply letting Star Wars be Star Wars. Let me know in the comment section what you think. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, don't. Nobody's forcing you to do anything here. Keyless alive, my friends, and until next time.
I should go.